Hey everyone! Welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing my top 10 fantasy books / series of all time. So I did this list 2 years ago, and since then I've read quite a few more fantasy series and fantasy books, so I thought I would do an updated list for you all and also call out any changes to that list from 2 years ago, because there are several of the series and books that were on that list before that have now been knocked off by some other series. So I still wanted to include those as honorable mentions, and then we'll get into the top 10. So starting with the 4 honorable mentions, because 4 series have been knocked off this list, and we'll start with what's probably going to be the most controversial of this video, and I'm sure I'll hear a lot about it in the comments. A Game of Thrones and the entire A Song of Ice and Fire series. This was on my top 10 list 2 years ago, and it has now since dropped off. I think a big reason is when I put the series on my list before, really what I was putting the series on that list for was for the first 3 books in the series. Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords. A Storm of Swords is probably one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. It's incredible. Everything happens in that book. I think it's one of the best fantasy books ever. However, the last 2 books in that series aren't my favorite. I actually found them a little bit tedious to get through at times, and because it's not a completed series, and to be honest, the show has kind of put a sour taste in my mouth a little bit. I still try to view the books as separate from the show as I can, but all of that has kind of made me realize that maybe this isn't a top 10. It could potentially be back in the top 10 if it ever does get finished, and if the conclusion is better than the show's conclusion. But A Game of Thrones, I still love the series. I still love the character work and the politics, and some of this is just the best in fantasy, I think. But those last 2 books and the fact that it's not a completed series, some others that I've completed have just overtaken it. So Song of Ice and Fire, still an honorable mention, still love so much about it, but it's no longer on the top 10. And then another one that's quite a surprise for me is the Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett, starting with Foundryside. Now, Foundryside and Shorefall, the first 2 books in this trilogy, absolute favorites, 5 out of 5 stars. I love the magic. I love the outcast crew that we follow in this book. I love the heist story in this first book. I love that the stakes were upped so much in the second book. The third book, though, was a little bit disappointing. I didn't love the conclusion of this trilogy, and that was a huge bummer because it could have firmly stayed in the top 10, but I'm realizing that what is in my top 10 is stuff that I loved every single book in that series. So because the third book in this one was a pretty big disappointment for me, it did unfortunately drop off the list. Again, there's still so much I love about it. I will always think Foundryside and Shorefall are one of my favorites, but the trilogy as a whole has now dropped out of my top 10. It's hard narrowing it down to only 10 fantasy series because there are so many good ones out there. Another one that's a surprise to me is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Black Sun made my list before. I had only read the first book in this series, and I believe this is going to be a trilogy, and I have since read the second book. And kind of like Foundryside, this second book in this series was a pretty big disappointment for me. Very much felt like that middle book syndrome where we're just kind of setting up characters to be in certain places and there was nothing really compelling happening, which was such a huge difference from the first book. I love Black Sun so much. The world building is so incredibly unique and cool, and the magic and the creatures and everything about it was just so cool. So to have that second book be such a disappointment was unfortunate, but I still love Black Sun. So it still had to be an honorable mention, and maybe with the conclusion of the trilogy, it could be back up on my top 10 list, but as of right now, it unfortunately did drop out of it. And then the last one that dropped out was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which I still love the Poppy War. I still love the Dragon Republic. I still think what R.F. Kuang did with this trilogy was so magnificent, and taking this real life historical event, the Sino-Japanese War, and putting this fantasy twist on it and commenting on the brutality and grotesque nature of war and these really, really morally gray characters that we follow, especially our main character, Rin. It's just so compelling. I just loved it. But the third book, The Burning God, was a pretty big disappointment as well. So unfortunately, that one, when I had put this series on my list, I think I had finished the trilogy, but it was still better than the other things I had read at the time. So I had it on the top 10, and since then I've read a couple of other series that have just knocked it out of the park with their endings. I've loved their endings. So this one, unfortunately, with me not loving its ending as much, it did drop off, but I still love the Poppy War. So that is the final honorable mention. So now that we have those out of the way, let's get into the actual top 10. And these are in no specific order until the final two. I do have a clear favorite and then a clear second favorite. So let's just start with whatever's at the top of my stack here, and that is Traitor's Blade by Sebastien de Castell and the entire Greatcoats series. I have finished the Greatcoats series, and I absolutely adored this series so much. Traitor's Blade for me was probably the weakest in the series, but I still absolutely loved it. And for me, every book just kept getting better and better, and that conclusion was so perfect for this series. I loved it. Knocked it out of the park. What I love about the Greatcoats so much is the characters and the camaraderie between the characters. They have an amazing friendship and an amazing dynamic with this group, this big cast of characters. I love the politics of this world. I love our main character of Falkio and how he just refuses to give in and just will always stand up for what he believes is the right thing. And it's just so compelling. The fight scenes in this series are amazing. They definitely have a ton of sword play throughout this series, and the way Sebastien de Castell writes these sword fights is so good. It's the way he choreographs it. I was so invested in those fight scenes, and I'm not usually one who loves fight scenes, and I was so hooked on them in this series. And it also is not all fun and games in this series. There are some really heavy moments, some really impactful emotional moments throughout this series as well that really hit hard. Some very horrible things that happen to these characters that these characters have to persevere through. And it was just really emotional at times, but at the end of the day, it was just a series about hope and justice, and I loved it. I loved every minute of this. So for me, Greatcoats definitely has to be in the top 10 now. That is a new addition to the top 10. This one was on the top 10 before, so Lord of the Rings is still on my top 10 by J.R.R. Tolkien. I think it deserves its place on every, best of fantasy list of all time. The way that J.R.R. Tolkien packs so much into so few pages compared to some other fantasy series that we get nowadays. He just built such an amazing world that was so fully realized. I loved the cast of characters. The friendship between Frodo and Sam is just legendary. Is it my favorite of all time? Probably not, but I still just have such an appreciation for this series and for these characters. I loved it. I loved my journey through Middle-earth and through Lord of the Rings. It was amazing. So had to be on this list again. It just had to be. The next one that was on this list before, that is still on this list, is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I actually preferred this one over Mistborn and over a couple of his other books, which might be more of an unpopular opinion, but what I love about Warbreaker is not only the cool magic system. The magic system's great, just like all of Sanderson's magic systems. Very cool, creative, unique. But I loved the more fun tone. This, I think, is the most fun I've had reading a Sanderson novel. And Trust of the Emerald Sea, I recently read, and that was a ton of fun. But for some reason, Warbreaker just stands out in my mind because I love the character dynamics so much. I love Lightsong. I love Vasher. I love Ciri and the God King. Just so much about this series. For me, I read it so long ago, but I still remember so much of it, and it's just fun. It was just a really good time. So I loved all these different elements that Sanderson somehow weaved all together and made work. And the fact that this is a standalone to me is even more impressive because he managed to pack all of this world building, pack all of this magic, and pack all of this character development into this one book. And it truly did have a great conclusion where I don't feel like I am missing out on anything else by not having more books in the series. I feel like I got a complete story that was very satisfying, so I love Warbreaker. Let's do another standalone, which is a new addition to this list as of this year, and that is Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Another one that, for me, standalone fantasies are incredibly impressive because usually in fantasies, they have to be multi-book series to allow time for the reader to get oriented to this brand new world that we're being introduced to. If there's magic or if there's fantastical creatures in it, we have to have time to really understand those things. And the fact that it's all packed into one book in such a satisfying way is incredible to me. So Guns of the Dawn, the way I pitch it is if Jane Austen wrote a military fantasy novel. It has a very Jane Austen-esque type main character, and she is conscripted into the army, and you are following her perspective as she is like boots on the ground in this war where she doesn't know if what she's fighting for is the real truth. It's not only this novel about this war and following those soldiers with boots on the ground during this war, but it's also examining themes of like, is the stuff that we are being fed about this war even true? Are we fighting for the right reasons? And are we on the right side? Those sorts of things are being examined in this book in such an interesting way. And I love our main character so much. There is also a very much Pride and Prejudice-esque type romance in this book that I thought was really well done. Just overall, this was such a wonderful story that I loved the character so much. I loved the plot of it so much. So again, a perfect standalone with a perfect conclusion. Let's chat through a couple others that were on the list before to get those out of the way. The first being The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, starting with Malice. This is another one that was on the list 2 years ago. It's going to be on this list again. For me, this feels very much like classic fantasy told through a more modern writing style. It's got a ton of your classic fantasy tropes like the chosen one, like the animal companion, like the mentor-mentee. It's got good versus evil. It's got all these very classic feeling fantasy tropes, but in my opinion, they're done in a very refreshing and unique way where they kind of take some of those tropes and turn them on their head a little bit. And I love just a good old classic fantasy story about good versus evil, right versus wrong. And this is what Faithful and the Fallen gave me. I loved the politics of this world, the cast of characters I was so invested in. I loved the writing style that John Gwynne had. The fight scenes, once again, I'm not a huge fan of fight scenes, so when an author can keep me invested in the story during these big epic fight scenes, I have to give a lot of credit because that's usually something that I kind of start to doze off. So I loved the fight scenes. There were such moments of huge triumph, such emotional moments throughout this series. I loved it, and tons of just twists and turns throughout as well. I truly love some of these characters, love to hate others in this series. So Faithful and the Fallen, I know it has a lot of mixed reviews out there, but for me, it's just a perfect, cozy feeling fantasy series with all those classic tropes that I absolutely love. Another one that was on the list before, The Bear and the Nightingale and the entire Winternight trilogy by Katherine Arden. Just a beautifully written, Russian-inspired trilogy of books that has a main character who is one of my favorite fantasy main characters of all time in Vasya. It has this subplot, this romantic subplot throughout the trilogy that I absolutely love. It definitely didn't revolve around that, but it was a nice little cherry on top for sure. I love especially the second book. Usually second books in trilogies are least favorites a lot of time. Usually they suffer from middle book syndrome. In this case, this trilogy has one of the best second books I've ever read. It made me so invested in the story. So The Bear and the Nightingale was actually not my favorite, but once I read that second and that third book, I was hooked. And the writing style, the atmosphere in this book is just so beautifully done. Of all of the books on this list, I would say the writing style that's the most beautiful for me is the Winter Night trilogy and Katherine Arden's writing style. Just stunning. I love this series. One more new one and one more old one before we get to my final top two. So the old one that was on my list from before is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. Vicious and Vengeful, the duology. I believe V.E. Schwab is going to continue on with this series, but I'm not quite sure how many books she has planned in this villains series. I probably will never put this out of my top 10. It's one of my all-time favorites for sure. And truly it's because of one character, him right there, Victor. Victor Vale is an incredible character. This is a book that follows two friends who were working on a thesis together in university around these people who are considered extraordinary. And the way they get these extraordinary abilities, these like superpower-like abilities, is by having near-death experiences. And so Victor and his best friend Eli decide to try to get extraordinary abilities themselves as part of this project that they're doing, and something goes terribly wrong that makes these two mortal enemies. And so what you have is this very fantasy-like X-Men story where you have all these characters who have had near-death experiences, and the way that manifests into these superhero-like powers is really fascinating. And you have a very morally gray cast of characters where you're not really sure who you should be rooting for, if you should be rooting for any of them at all, but you somehow love all of them. And I love that type of stuff. And the mystery behind what caused this friendship to completely shatter is just very much intriguing and keeps you turning the pages. So I love both Vicious and Vengeful, and it will probably always be on my top 10. And one more new one to the list this year, and then we will get to my top two favorites, and that is Under the Northern Sky trilogy by Leo Carew, starting with The Wolf. Now this is a surprise to me because when I read The Wolf, I liked it. I didn't love it. I really liked certain aspects of it. Again, it kind of has these morally gray characters, and it has this war between these two peoples who neither of them are really like right or wrong. It's just kind of like a territorial dispute, and you're not really sure who you should be rooting for. And it's kind of this alternate history fantasy where it takes the idea of if the Neanderthals had evolved alongside Homo sapiens, what would the world look like? And so you have very little magic in this trilogy, and it was exploring some really cool concepts in this first book. Then the second book, The Spider, was even better. It had improved upon everything from this first book, and I was like, okay, I'm really digging this. I really loved this second book. And then by the third book, The Cuckoo, I fell head over heels in love. Every book just kept getting better and better. And the fact that The Cuckoo, for me, it's one of the best fantasy conclusions I've ever read. And I think I've come to realize how rare that is for a series to improve with every single book and then stick the landing so well. So many other series, especially the ones that dropped off this list, have dropped off because of those disappointing conclusions. So it felt only right to include the trilogy that I feel has one of the best conclusions. So again, there's really nothing fantastical about this series. It really is just an alternate history, but the way in which events unfold, the way in which themes are explored, and the cast of characters that you follow, it's just all so compelling. And truly, that third book has some of the biggest twists and turns, has some of the biggest emotional moments, and it has an ending that I think is so perfect for what this trilogy is, even though it's so bittersweet. So all of that to say, check out Under the Northern Sky. It's very, very underrated. So now let's get to my top 2. So my second favorite series of all time, it's an ongoing series, so we'll see if it stays at the top, but it probably will. And that is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is the Kraken Book Company dust jackets that are alternate dust jackets to the series. So Way of Kings and Stormlight Archive, it's one of my favorites. It was on the list 2 years ago. It'll probably be on the list 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It'll probably always be on this list because of it feels the most epic in nature of all of these series, and the cast of characters that we follow I love so much, and the world is something so unlike anything I've ever read. And for me, Sanderson's writing style, even though it's very straightforward, it's very much to the point, it's not very flowery, it's nothing to write home about. For me, it serves the story in such a way that I get lost in the story. Even with a humongous book like this, I fly through the pages because of that writing style, that type of writing style. I think it just serves the story so well for me. I know that there's a lot of people who think Sanderson is overhyped, and I completely get it. But for me, I love the Stormlight Archive so much, and I think it deserves every bit of hype it gets. It's just one of the most epic, awesome, creative stories I've truly ever read, and goodness gracious, I hope it sticks the landing. Oh, I really hope it does. So yeah, I love the magic, I love the world, and I love the characters. It's the best. And then finally, my favorite fantasy series of all time, as of right now, is a new one to this list. It is Legends of the First Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. So take everything that I had said about Faithful and the Fallen, about it being like this classic feeling fantasy series with all those tropes that we know, and putting a modern spin on it. And that is definitely Legends of the First Empire and the entire world of Elon that Michael J. Sullivan has created. Rhaeria Revelations, Rise and Fall, all of it. It definitely has that classic fantasy feeling because of the very traditional world building that it has. It's humans, it's elves, and it's dwarves, and some goblins in this world. And so you have just like a very traditional setup. But the way in which the politics play out, the way in which the characters are developed, that for me is that modern feeling to it. And what I love so much about Legends of the First Empire, I love this cast of characters more than any other cast of characters. The emotional highs, the emotional lows, the emotional gut punches, it's just amazing. Super epic, I love this. I'll continue to shout about it from the rooftop. So that is my top 10 favorite fantasy series / books of all time. What do you think of this list? Let me know in the comments down below. And then what is your favorite fantasy book or series of all time? Let me know that in the comments down below as well. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!